Welcome to Boston Jewish Now. We are recording on Wednesday, March 25th. And before we get to our guest, I want to offer a little bit of context for what we're talking about today. So this past Sunday in the Globe Ideas section, there was a piece about which we've heard from many members of the community. And this particular column asserted that the rise in anti-Semitism in the United States was largely caused by how the Jewish community was responding to anti-Semitism. And I want to ensure and inform our listeners that certainly we at JCRC, along with many of our member and partner organizations, have been reaching out to the Boston Globe editors, engaging with them. I know that a number of leaders and organizations, including myself, have submitted written responses, and we'll see what comes of this in the coming days. But we wanted to pull back a little bit and name that many of the ideas and themes that we were all reading in this particular piece have become quite prevalent in a lot of spaces in the public discourse, especially in the weeks since the war with Iran began. And while there is certainly an important and legitimate public debate to be had over the war, how it is being fought, what the self-interests of the United States are, and how we participate as a nation in the region, we've also seen a real spike in discourse that raises very troubling ideas about Jews, who we are, our role in society, and the extent to which the United States is acting in the interests of the nation or because of, shall we say, the undue influence of the Jewish community. And to help us unpack some of those themes and tropes and how we, as leaders, as institutions, as members of the community, can be engaging them and responding to them in our conversations, in our communications with the papers, we're very pleased to have a friend of ours, Oren Jacobson, joining us here on the podcast. And for those of you who don't know, Oren is a civic entrepreneur and the CEO of Project Shema, an organization dedicated to helping communities better understand and respond to contemporary anti-Jewish bias and anti-Jewish ideas. He is a partner both to JCRC and to CJP in some of the initiatives that we are working on, training and supporting community activists. And I was very pleased and appreciative that he joined us last year before the Massachusetts Special Commission to help our commissioners and leaders on Beacon Hill to understand anti-Semitism and the discourse around it. So Oren, welcome to our podcast.
Good to see you, Jeremy. How are you, buddy?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
Another day in paradise. Jeremy, I far too often say to people, I don't know how this work could get any harder. And then tomorrow something else happens like, oh, that's how it can get harder.
It does seem like there is something new every day. And yet also it feels all of a kind, nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
And as you have taught me, and I think we'll get into some of the tropes and some of the things that are out there are really just adaptations of things that we've been seeing for a very long time. So I want to talk about this idea, and you've obviously read this op-ed piece that I referenced. You've also been seeing a lot of the stuff around the country. What do you see as the emerging themes that are so problematic, knowing that people in our community are having reactions to them? And what are you identifying that we need to be paying attention to?
So I want to take a step back and I think one of the things that we're struggling with as a community, forget the outside world, Jeremy, is just we're having a hard time talking to each other over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is, just our own fear, trauma, lack of sense of safety and security. And, as a reminder, our actual calling as the people of Israel is to literally wrestle. And I think it's important to wrestle with these ideas, not simply to swat them away, but to actually try to find space for some amount of empathy and understanding about what's underneath the surface here. And so, I think there's a few things that all of us should be very aware of as a starting point and just acknowledge. One is, there's a lot of frustration and anger about the actions of the Israeli government over the last 2 years. And that's not just limited, by the way, to sort of the progressive side of the Jewish community. That exists inside of, quote unquote, mainline Jewish communal life, inside of mainstream Jewish community institutions as well. There's a lot of people who are also obviously frustrated with the Jewish establishment's response to those things. Though I think some of the points in the piece are a little bit overstated of what's actually happening in those spaces. There's obviously in a Jewish community in America that is about 70% Democratic voting, a ton of anger towards Donald Trump, and then you have the relationship between the president and the prime minister. And I think the through line in this piece that I think is really interesting, because our friend Eli Cohn-Postel, who used to work at the JCRC and now is the VP of Education at Project Shema, is working on a piece right now that he started before this piece in question got written, trying to help the Jewish world recognize that a central point of this entire debate internally is the debate about safety and security.
Yeah.
And the author really in this piece is talking about the idea of what is making Jews unsafe, what is making his children here unsafe. And I think as a starting point, I want to hold and humanize all of those things, because I think they really matter. And to the extent that we're going to try to have a conversation with each other across those differences, that's really necessary. I also want to point out the fact that what I think is a challenge, not just in this piece, but in many spaces, and especially more progressive discourse, is what I would describe as moral certainty that leads to moral judgment that essentially flattens and eliminates the possibility that any other perspective has any moral validity in it whatsoever, right? So as an example, one of the major points of criticism here is that the mainstream Jewish community is not speaking up enough about Bibi Netanyahu, about the right, like the far right in Israel, about settler violence, etc. And while, again, I don't sort of fully buy the argument in its entirety, I also recognize that there are many Jews who feel those things, but because there are literally hundreds of millions, if not more, people online every day making those same exact points, they're not saying them at the same volume or consistency, because they're also afraid to pile on in a moment in which Jews are being attacked literally everywhere because of that. Okay, so with that as the sort of pretext of trying to create a space of humanization for the friends in your life for whom this piece resonates with, and actually create space to have a conversation across that line of difference, recognizing, I think, Jeremy, that your reaction to it, which may not be the same as mine, is also very much rooted in this question of what is going to make us safe or not safe as a community here, let alone Jews globally. There's a few things that really jumped out to me in this. The first is obviously that this idea that Jewish institutions in America and their failure to respond to what Bibi Netanyahu's doing or Donald Trump is doing is making Jews unsafe is just classic victim blaming at its core. Right? Mm-hmm. It's essentially holding the victims of bigotry accountable for the perpetrators of that bigotry. That to me is a deeply problematic and challenging idea. And I think if we swap the Jewish community out for another community, I don't think that we would buy that argument as a fair argument. Fair to criticize the lack of condemnation. Fair to say the Jewish community is failing its ethical and moral obligations if that's how you feel, or the state of Israel is failing to meet us. But that is very different, making that critique, than saying the fact that Jewish institutions here are not doing enough, or whatever it is that they're doing, is actually causing the increase in anti-Semitism, to me, is, as a starting point, classic victim blaming.
I'm hearing two themes that I want to lift up, and if there are others that I missed that you want to come back to, I would invite you to do that. And before I go there, of course, I'll give you credit that you steal the best and the brightest away from us, and we would be happy to have Eli come back and maybe do a podcast to talk about what some of he's thinking.
He's
writing,
doing interesting research and thinking right now.
We miss him terribly here at JCRC, and are very happy that he gets to do some of the work and the projects that we're doing together here in Boston. But the two themes, one of which is this sort of flattening of the realities of who is the organized mainstream broad Jewish community and what we're talking about. This sort of like everybody is failing to criticize, the government of Israel in the ways that I want them to be criticizing the government of Israel, whoever I is. And,
right.
Holding a network of 40 plus organizations across a broad diversity, I know that we have many, many member organizations and many, many members of our community who are both critical of the government of Israel, publicly critical of the government of Israel, and for different reasons.
Yeah.
So there is that reality that is being flattened.
Right.
And then what I'm also hearing is a second theme, which is, I think, really important, particularly to some of our partners and friends beyond the Jewish community, is this essentializing of Jewish power. That somehow that the victim blaming is connected to we actually have the power to do all the things we're being accused of doing here. And that because we are doing or not doing something, therefore society as a whole is in a certain place. And that is certainly overstating the influence of maybe, one particular organization on the ability to shape the entirety of discourse around Jewish power and influence.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, again, the piece is representative of an argument you hear not just inside of the Jewish world, but more broadly, which essentially is this argument that says, either the Zionists or the Jews or the Israeli government is manipulating, controlling the United States government, right? So let's take President Trump for a second. On the one hand, there's an argument that President Trump is the strongest person on the face of the earth, vis-a-vis he leads the strongest nation on the face of the earth, right? He is the supreme, he controls the strongest military, etc. As somebody who is an autocratic dictator type figure. And on the other side, there's an infantilizing, which says Donald Trump is actually listening to anybody. On the one hand, there is an argument, which, by the way, I buy into, and I'm not totally disconnected from the first part of the argument. I mean, I think what Donald Trump's doing from the standpoint of democracy in this country is deeply dangerous. But setting that aside, there's also an argument.
As do I.
Yeah, exactly. Which, and by the way, this piece almost seems to frame the vast majority of Jews as on the side of Trump, and American Jews on the side of Trump and Bibi de facto, which I think is obviously not an accurate statement for the American Jewish community. Then there's the argument about Trump as corrupt, which again, I think Donald Trump and his administration are incredibly corrupt. And despite the fact that we have an endless amount of reporting about the Saudi royal family urging the president of the United States to go to war and to stay at war. And despite the fact that the entity with whom Donald Trump has the most possible financial ties to happen to be the Saudi regime, there is no conversation happening whatsoever about the Saudis dragging Trump into war. It's just a focus on Bibi. Now, granted, the war right now is Israel and the United States against Iran. But the idea that Donald Trump is anything other than a Iran hawk literally ignores 40 plus years of Donald Trump talking about this regime. You can go back to when the hostage crisis happened and hear what he is saying and how many times he's advocating for literally using force to go after this regime over the course of his entire career. And so what ends up, rather than thinking about the fact that Donald Trump and this current United States regime, which you may not agree with, believes it's in the national interest of the United States to strike the regime now, you end up in a story that literally says the reason we're doing this is because the Jewish state pulled and hoodwinked Donald Trump into something. I don't buy the idea that Donald Trump does anything other than what Donald Trump wants to do. And I don't think there's any data in Donald Trump's history which suggests that Donald Trump listens to anybody or does anything besides what he wants to do. So when you're making this argument, you're literally saying the Jews control the United States government, or this group of Jews controls the United States government, which is just classically an anti-Jewish trope that I also think is just not borne out, no matter how angry you are about the war. It's not borne out in any of who Donald Trump is historically. Right. What the United States posture has been towards Iran for literally 50 years and the other actors at play who Donald Trump has much more to gain from. And I'll add one more thing in here, which I think matters, and then I'll pause, which is rightfully many, including you and me and the author, one of the places where we would agree is we're deeply concerned about the rise and normalization of like far-right, white supremacist ideology, which, by the way, also has a deep intersection with like, you see the anti-Zionist rhetoric coming up on the far right as well. And when you have that movement and potentially in control of a government, that's never historically been good for our community. And we look at this administration, and rather than saying Israel is dragging the United States into war, while we're arguing that far-right anti-Semitism is the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism, the concern we should be elevating is the administration setting up Jews and Israel as the scapegoat if this war goes bad? That, to me, is what's like missing in this. It gives so much, like it infantilizes Trump so much, and it gives such good faith to the basic argument, while also at the same time saying right-wing anti-Semitism is the primary concern. And so I just said a bunch of things in there that are like, thoughts so you can react to, but that's a few layers of this for me that are challenging.
Yeah, I mean, you covered a lot of ground there, and so I want to pull out some things and come back again. I think it's really valuable to affirm we're not having a discussion about whether the war and the U.S. role in the war is right or wrong. There are differences of opinion within our community, and there are differences of opinion within all communities. What we are talking about is the narrative around the why or the agency of, say, the president. And there's certainly no question that whatever one agrees or disagrees with President Trump on a variety of topics, he is certainly a man who has a very clear personal understanding of his self-interest.
His own interests.
And U.S. self-interest, which goes back decades and decades, and not just on the topic of in the Middle East, but on a wide range of things. He has been quite consistent with regard to broad theme understanding of that. And it's fine, and it's important to debate that. And that's one of the tensions here, is that debate isn't happening in the ways it needs to be in Washington and elsewhere. But certainly the idea that he is subject to a particular point of influence, and solely, I think you're making that point, solely that point of influence, it's absolutely legitimate for two allies to sit down and have a conversation. What are our shared interests, and how do we act on those shared interests together? It's entirely something else to say this one partner and not the others had an undue influence and therefore is now to blame for whatever cost and loss may come to the United States as a result of it. I also you talked about the far right, and you're absolutely right. There's a important conversation within the Jewish community and within these institutions that are being flattened in this column about where the greatest threats are to the safety of the Jewish community. And within our own community and the network that we hold, there are those who say the strongest threats to our safety are coming from the far right and white supremacists, and those who feel that the strongest threat is coming from the far left. There are also those, and I will include myself clearly in this, who believe that the greatest threat to the future of the Jewish community in the United States is the collapse of our pluralistic democracy and the norms of a society in which we hold our differences, we are belonging without regard to race, gender, religion, and it's that our unifying national thing is an idea, a creed, and not an ethnicity or a religion. All of those questions, all of those conversations about safety are very much a part of our community and very much part of different organizations within the community's public activism, public voice, and public leadership. And yet we see this willfulness to ignore all of that, or to ignore those elements and just say the whole community, every part of it, only cares about one particular kind of anti-Semitism, and we're ignoring everything else. And that's both patently false
Yeah.
And it's also interesting in the context of the discourse that's happening in the last few weeks around the war, which is the classic, the horseshoe theory, that we are seeing actors at one ideological extreme lifting up and frankly platforming on podcasts people who are on the other end of the ideological extreme on this issue. For example, we saw obviously the resignation of a White House official in recent weeks, and then we saw senators who but a year ago had said he was completely unqualified for the job, saying he's speaking
because of
truth
deep white
to power.
supremacist ties, right? Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I remember a professor I had in grad school who his suggestion to me was always dial back your argument 10% and use words that create space.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I actually think, and by the way, I live in Illinois. We just had a really messy, ugly primary that AIPAC was like the central story in a week ago. And for me, I actually think there's so much in this piece that is part of the discourse that I have in many, many places across the country with folks inside of our community about how is it that our institutions are actually engaging the problems that we're facing. Like, I think that there's a real critical set of conversations and questions about the way our institutions are doing what they're doing right now. And I think when you go from that step to the institutions are the reason why we're becoming less safe, that to me is really where you cross this line that makes the conversation so hard to even have. Mm-hmm. Because you're going beyond this question of like, what should our institutions do to address the situation into, again, this sort of moral condemnation and moral certainty and judgment, and placing the blame for Jews being attacked onto Jews. One of the things that I struggled with in this basic framework, and obviously, like, we started Project Shema in part because we felt like there was a gap, by the way, in the way that our community was thinking about anti-Semitism as it comes up in discourse around Israel and Palestine. And we come at it from a lens that's, I think, more progressive than most anti-Semitism education organizations out there. So my guess is, with most of the folks that have the feelings that this author does, there's going to be a heck of a lot of agreement between me and our entire team and folks like that. And at the same time, what I sort of have reflected on in reading this piece is like, okay, if I can find a null case, right? If I can find something that disproves this basic idea, then the idea doesn't hold water. And so here's what I started to think about. How do you explain not what's happening in the United States? Let's assume that what's happening in the United States is actually because of quote unquote mainstream institutional failure. Let's accept the argument. Okay. How do I explain Australia? Mm-hmm. How do I explain Canada? How do I explain Belgium? How do I explain the Netherlands? How do I explain London? How do I explain France? Yeah. Right. How do I explain the experiences of Jews being attacked? Forget Israel for a second. Mm-hmm. How do I explain the experiences of the dramatic surge in violence, to say nothing of any other form of discrimination, targeting Jews in all of these places? Australia has fewer than 200,000 Jews in the country. It does not have nearly the infrastructure or influence, or political and civic networks and engagements that our community has. And yet, we saw what happened on Bondi Beach, right? So if the cause of this violence and the cause of these attacks is about the way that we're responding here, then I would argue that what should be happening here should be unique to here. Mm-hmm. But it's not unique to here, and that's the challenge. We can fairly, rightfully, and necessarily criticize many of the things our institutions are doing in response. But if the cause is the institutions themselves, then it should be unique to the United States. Mm-hmm. But it's not unique to the United States. It's literally happening to Jewish communities in diaspora everywhere on earth right now, where they don't have our institutional structure, they don't have our civic culture, they don't have our integration politically and civically, and yet they're still being attacked day in, day out, ostensibly for the crimes of the state of Israel, but inside of their own country, where they're citizens of another country and not citizens of the state of Israel.
And I would, that resonates very deeply. And I would add to your point, and in several of those example countries, states in which the state itself are not publicly expending state resources in support of Israel or in allyship with Israel.
There's no tax dollars being involved. There's no military assets being involved. There's no other political tie that you could overtly make between that government and the state of Israel in this particular question.
So when reframing the analysis in the way that you just did of where anti-Semitism is rising and therefore the logic hole in these arguments about the role of American Jewish institutions in causing the anti-Semitism, what do you then provide as the answer for why, in fact, it is rising simultaneously across this wide swath of countries?
Look, I think what's abundantly clear is that institutional leaders across all of these countries have struggled significantly in the aftermath of October 7th and then October 8th and the war in Gaza to deal with what I would define as actually like a hard challenge for people who are not anti-Semitism experts. It's a challenge for people who are anti-Semitism experts, which is, how do you speak about and respond to a situation in which you have two historically marginalized targeted groups dealing with legitimate, real, intense lack of safety concerns? That's not something that most liberal to progressive leaders across especially Western democratic societies are well equipped to do, right? Like, they're well equipped to speak very quickly about who is powerful and who is oppressed and get on the right side of that thing, but they've struggled mightily. And so what I think has happened is that there's been a massive permission structure given towards social exclusion at best, and to some cases outright permission structures for violence at worst, by, in many cases, well-intentioned people who don't wish harm being unable to sort of push back where there are actual acts of demonization and dehumanization happening, right? Like, that to me is the central challenge in this particular moment. And I'm not even like, this isn't me condemning those individuals. This is me actually thinking about, because I work with them all the time, being very sympathetic and empathetic to the challenges of a university president who didn't get into the job to deal with the consequences of this, thinking about, like, caring about the safety and concerns of the Palestinian people, which they should, people advocating for the realities and aspirations of the Palestinian peoples, which they should, and trying to figure out how to also hold in their hand at the same time the concerns and safety and security of the Jewish people, which they should. But where they failed is to differentiate what is, I don't want to say legitimate, because legitimate is what is actual criticism of actual policies of the state of Israel or the United States government's contributions to those policies, and the holding to account the demonization and dehumanization of individual Jews and or Jewish institutions who are not actually responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. That, to me, has been the central challenge. And if you look at like the causes of violence in the last 2 years, almost all of them are coming from, the violence we've had recently has not been violence targeting Jews from what you think of as like the traditional far-right, kind of right-wing white supremacist. I'll add one more thing because I think it's really important, at least in the domestic context, Jeremy, lest anybody confuse my political orientation. I think the ascension of Donald Trump to the presidency in 2016 in particular lifted the lid and gave permission to the American people to start demonizing, dehumanizing, and bullying everybody. And that, like, our politics was just fundamentally different. You don't have to say better, but our politics was fundamentally different until the Donald Trump campaign of 2016. And we have just, since he came to power, the politics of demonization and dehumanization and bullying have grown more and more common on the political right and the political left. And it's become a maximalist pursuit of power in both directions, which then I think leaves people much more willing to tolerate folks inside of their coalition in the pursuit of power that are pushing aggressively anti-Semitic tropes, whether it be someone like Nick Fuentes or Tucker Carlson, you know, for whom Vice President Vance seems uninterested or unwilling to call out for what is just blatant conspiratorial, traditional, classical anti-Semitism, or some provocateurs on the far left who, routinely want to describe, the idea of Jewish national self-determination as akin to a white supremacist project that must be dismantled and eliminated if we are to, reach the utopia we're longing for. And both of those things are happening all around us. I'm with you on the democracy and pluralism piece, that we need a democratic society that is pluralistic in nature for Jews to be safe. And I would also argue that for every minority group in this country, we need a democratic society with protections and civil rights and pluralism for those communities to be safe and thrive. Because absent those things, you get into maximalist power politics, and whoever wins that fight is going to go after all of their enemies, perceived or real. And that's why that type of violence, that type of approach at the state level, historically has not been restricted just to the political right. It's also come from the political left when you lose that sort of pluralistic approach to civil discourse and civil engagement.
I know I'm going to get all sorts of pushback for what I did or did not say. I agree with you, or I push back on you because we are an incredibly diverse network here. I will affirmatively echo that the toxic nature of our politics in this country, I would argue, before the election of 2016 and rapidly and vastly normalized since 2016, is a grave and existential threat to the safety of the Jewish community and all Americans. And that is very much at the heart of what should be our shared concerns about how we move forward. And I want to bring it back to something that you made this point in the context of support for Palestinian humanity, dignity, aspirations, that these need not be binaries, that
right.
The discourse rapidly moves to this is an in-group, this is an out-group, both in this country
right.
and in the conversation in the Middle East. And your point being, we have to have a conversation in which all peoples are valued, have dignity, and that we resist dehumanization, whether it is against Jews, whether it is against Palestinians, Israelis, the Iranian people, etc.
Yeah. I'm 100% with you on that, right? Which is like, we've been presented with a false choice that like binary thinking is inherently antithetical to what I would describe as like the tenets of Judaism. Mm-hmm. It's also antithetical to pluralism, and therefore I think it's antithetical to democracy. I think binary thinking actually weakens our movements for progress. Like, I think you and I are firmly rooted with long track records of working for progressive causes in this country, are part of what I would describe as a broad pro-democracy coalition that's deeply worried about the erosion of democracy. And like, beating back authoritarian movements actually requires big tent pluralism. And so I think that the overarching challenge, set aside the question of what plays into anti-Semitism here, or the flattening of the Jewish community, its diversity. I think the absence of a non-binary pluralistic approach to this argument is actually really, really critical, because it ends up creating a dividing line that makes it really difficult for us to do the yes ands here, right? So as an example, I think it's a more than fair question to ask and criticism to levy about the ways in which AIPAC has decided to use, political action committee, right? Like big dark money heavily in New Jersey and Illinois, the impact of that on the community, right? That wasn't AIPAC's model 10 years ago. It is AIPAC's model now. I think that's a really fair question. I think we can talk about the decisions of whether or not Jewish institutions are doing enough publicly to speak out against the far right creep in Israel, against, like the settler violence or terrorism, whatever word you want to put on it, that is happening there, with a government that is either unwilling or unable or unwilling to actually crack down on extremists attacking Palestinians. All those things can and should happen. And what is happening in the United States as well as globally is that individual Jews and Jewish communities are being held accountable for the actions, real or imagined, of the state of Israel, that anti-Jewish tropes, typically about Jews as powerful, Jews as inherently evil, Jews as untrustworthy, either expressly or covertly, are being trafficked throughout the rhetoric around this war and the broader war since October 7th, that Jews are being demonized and dehumanized, and it's leading to a permission structure that's enabling violence and at times, by the way, justifying violence, right? The attack in Michigan at the synagogue, what you saw almost immediately was people saying, but Israel did this.
Yeah.
And if Israel did this, then you could say this is horrible. But there should be no but about a person driving a car with weapons into a synagogue in the United States at a group of people who are not accountable for the actions of whatever it is that the government of the state of Israel did. But we can only do that if we do what it is that you're suggesting, which is reject the false choice. And the false choice in my mind is built on something I said at the beginning, which is moral certainty, which leads to moral judgment and condemnation, which essentially then forecloses the possibility, Jeremy, that if you have any nuance of disagreement or a different perspective to offer, that your perspective may be worth considering, that it might actually be morally grounded and rooted, and that your perspective may not necessarily be fully dismissing all of the other things that need to be talked about. And I would argue that that inability is actually part of what is making our community and all communities less safe, because we're struggling to push back on what I would describe as highly polarized, divisive approaches to politics, which are forcing either ors on top of us, and in-group, out-group, and in-group, out-group frameworks just never work out well in the long run for communities that are minorities in particular.
Yeah. So I want to wrap us up and give you the last word, and to lift up a point that you've made as well. These debates, these questions, these critiques of Jewish communal voice and leadership are real and are happening. Yeah. You use a number of examples. I will absolutely affirm, like, the discussion about what American Jews should be saying or doing in response, for example, to the horrific settler West Bank violence that we are seeing for quite some time, and with dramatic and consequences of increase in recent weeks and days that are just horrifying and contemptible. There is a real debate going on. There is real argument and critique going on of Jewish organizations about what we have said or not said publicly or privately, and that's totally legitimate and fair. And to your point, that can never be a rationale or an apology for violence committed against Jews here in the United States, in the same way that whatever happens elsewhere can never be used. And let's just say there's an incredible rise in demonization of the American Muslim community, including from members of Congress in weeks and weeks. That's not permissible either. And that is not part of how you build a civic society. Final question to you, knowing our audience, knowing we started this in the context of people in our community reading and responding and having an emotional and psychological response to a particular column, what would your advice be to local Jewish activists, local Jewish community members, when they are seeing some of these tropes in the public discourse, when they are seeing some of these ideas being normalized in our media? What would you advise them to say or do, and how can they learn more about Project Shema?
Well, to learn more about Project Shema, you can go to projectshema.org. And for the Hebrew speakers out there, the apostrophe in Shema is not good for a website. So it's SHEMA, projectshema.org. Look, I think you sort of started off talking about the flattening, right? The sort of essentialization or overgeneralized nature of the argument, which is, I spend a lot of time across a wide swath of the community, traveling the country, and a very wide swath of the community ideologically, because of the work that we do. And I'm not aware of any Jewish institution that isn't actively, at least internally, having really vociferous debates about how to respond to all of these things. Mm-hmm. I think part of the challenge, especially if you're a local Jewish activist, is that it is really easy for non-Jewish peers to take a piece like this or somebody else's, thing on social media and assume it to be representative of the Jewish population that they are in relationship with or they're in coalition with, right? That like anybody who doesn't hold this piece is like a MAGA voter or something like that. And the only way to actually circumvent that is actually to be willing to speak up and to engage within your networks to make sure people know that like it's actually a more complicated thing for you than this, and that you are concerned about the way in which this piece or this type of argument actually both undermines Jewish safety and frankly lets the United States government off the hook for its own decisions and potentially sets up Jews as the fall community in multiple directions for this, which is exactly how Jewish safety has been eroded over time. And it's obviously like helpful if you're engaging people that you have a relationship with, as opposed to just posting randomly on social media, thinking about your networks and relationships to institutional leaders, whether it's at a university or at a nonprofit or in politics or in someone's staff. And that if you're not helping, if you're not reaching out and engaging people in a more complicated conversation, then these types of ideas just sort of like become the de facto, this is what it means to be a progressive Zionist or a liberal Zionist or somebody who, whatever framework you want to put in, or progressive Jew. And so that's hard. It carries a social cost. It carries an emotional burden. But no one's going to ultimately do it for us. And by the way, I think as you're doing it, you should be authentically you, right? Now, Jeremy, it's a little bit more complicated as the role that you play. You represent an entity and you represent, and by the way, I do too, right? And
as I keep quoting the poet, we contain multitudes.
We contain multitudes. But even though the JCRC contains multitudes, Jeremy also, the human being, contains multitudes, so does Oren. And like Project Shema actually doesn't do any public work on policy, advocacy, the history of the conflict, etc. We talk about how ideas can undermine Jewish inclusion and safety, even regardless of intent. Like, this is not an intent question, right? Like, I believe at the core, the piece that has caused this is like, comes from a place of love for the Jewish people, a concern about the safety of the Jewish people. I would like the piece to broaden out its scope to think about Jews beyond the United States and Jews in Israel, and what does safety mean and look like for them too, and grapple with that in a more deep way. But if you don't, as an individual, offer up your individual complex perspective with people that you trust, then what they're going to take away is a flattened dialogue, a flattened discourse, and that's not going to help. That's not going to help any of us. And it's important that if you feel like you can, that you do. If you feel like you don't have the skills to do so, but the desire, that you reach out to the JCRC, to CJP, to other local institutions, and seek out training and support and resources. Because the only way that we're going to sort of get through this moment, I think, with minimized damage and, have a chance to pursue what it is I think most of us want to pursue in this country, or aspirations for Israel and Palestine, is by that civic engagement. And actually, I have lots of criticisms of the Jewish communal institutions. I tend to not bring them publicly because I think that there's some conversations are best, inside the family. And I think one of the things that has been beautiful about what's been built in the United States of America that is unique in the Jewish diasporic history for thousands of years is we have built such a wide-ranging network of civically engaged, communally engaged Jewish institutions that provide each member of our community who wants it a pathway to meaningfully engage in some way, shape, or form Jewishly with Jews and advocate on a wide range of issues. And by the way, that range is really, really big. From the 40 institutions that you represent that probably have a very wide range of policy positions on domestic and foreign politics, to others. And like, that's a beautiful thing that there are all these containers, if you will, for us to be civically engaged, which means there's lots of relationships, which means we have a chance to communicate and share that perspective, which, by the way, as I mentioned earlier, is not true for most other diaspora communities today, and it's not true for most other diaspora communities historically. So whatever criticisms you have of all the institutions, there's also opportunities for your engagement and you to improve them and to engage beyond the community in ways that can help us. So that would be my encouragement, is we need you.
Well, on that note, and with the invitation to say that I look forward to sharing some of my criticisms of other institutions publicly when I write my memoir, which isn't coming anytime soon. I want to thank our guest, Oren Jacobson. He's a friend, he's wise, and he is in the trenches every day offering his wisdom and guidance. And I appreciate him for what he's able to put up with. And
you have to promise that your memoir is going to include at least a page of criticisms on Project Shema.
Ooh, okay. Better start working on that part.
There you go.
Thank you, Oren. I look forward to having you back in other contexts with us and in our work. And we will certainly welcome those who want to learn more about Project Shema and some of the projects we're doing together and some of the places to learn about their work in Boston. You can come to us or CJP. And as always, I want to invite people, give us your feedback, what other topics you'd be interested in hearing us talk about or help you navigate as we move in the civic space together. So thank you.